And welcome, everyone. I am Brock Lee, the founder and president of the Young Earth Creation Organization based in Owatonna, Minnesota. My presentation for you today is called Carbon Dating Dinosaurs. There are two methods for carbon dating. I'll assume that everyone has heard of carbon dating. It's a measurement actually of a ratio between different isotopes of carbon. There's normal carbon, which is called carbon-12, because it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus. Then there's two more isotopes of carbon, carbon-13, which has 1 extra neutron, and carbon-14, which has 2 extra neutrons. And so carbon dating works by taking a ratio of the two carbon-12 and carbon-14. And by comparing that ratio in the bones of once living creatures or in tree tissue, like wood or something like that, something that was once alive, and then comparing it to the ratio we have in the atmosphere today, they try to figure out how long that object has been dead to figure out its age. And there are two methods for doing carbon dating. The original method had a maximum of 50,000 years. However, recently there was a new kind of instrument tool, big tool, like the size of this room, called an accelerator mass spectrometer, or abbreviated AMS. And it actually doubled the precision, the length that we could measure objects, because the original carbon dating only went to 50,000 years. Now, using the accelerator mass spectrometer, we could measure things up to 100,000 years old. So, I just want to point that out. Notice that if something is, well, if something has no radioactive carbon-14 in it, it will read as 0, basically. 0 carbon-14, and then doing the mathematics, you would get at an age of infinite, because there's no carbon-14 in it, so it could be infinite, and then what these laboratories would say would be minimum 50,000 years. Or if they're using the AMS system, minimum 100,000 years. I want to point this out because that's key. So if we get dates near the 50,000 year range, or for the accelerator mass spectrometer near the 100,000 year range, then we should start to worry. Let's go on. Readings at the maximum age essentially mean there is no carbon-14 left, so the age cannot be determined by carbon dating, as I've already said. Dinosaurs were supposed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago. And if you write out 65 million, it's a 65 followed by 6 zeros, lots of zeros. That's what it looks like when you write it out. Now, if this age is correct, there should be no carbon-14 whatsoever, because carbon-14 should be completely gone in 100,000 years. Which means that we shouldn't be able to carbon date dinosaur bones at all. We should get, every single test we do should be the absolute maximum age for whatever method we're using. If it's the 50,000 one, they should read 50,000 plus. If it's the 100,000 year method, it should be 100,000 years plus, because we shouldn't be able to measure them with carbon dating if they are that old. I'm going to be talking today about research that shows that they're not that old. And the reason that I brought that up, and which you'll see in a moment, is that the dates that we get for the dinosaurs are not near enough to the terminus, the end point of that method, to even make it questionable. I'm going to be reporting today on research that was originally done by a different creation group called the Creation Research Science Education Foundation, or CRSEF, which was started about, I think, in the mid-1970s. And then what they did is about 10 years ago, they got together and said, hey, we need to have a group of people who looks at this carbon dating thing, and also the Paluxy tracks and some other things. And so they founded and funded a subset group of theirs called the Paleo Group, or called the Paleochronology Group, or Paleo Group for short. So I'm reporting on research done by them. One of the main people in this group was Hugh Miller, who has become very famous in creationist circles for his carbon dating research on this. Like I said, the Paleo Group was formed to focus on the polexitrax and carbon dating of dinosaur bones. Now, I'm not a member of either of those groups, and my only contribution was to take the data that they had, and they were displaying it in articles, in lists, in tables, and I thought to myself, you know, there's so many different ways of graphing data, of analyzing data. There's got to be a better way to present it than in these lists and tables. So my contribution is the graphs that you'll be seeing in this presentation. That's my only contribution to this effort. And this is one of the main graphs we'll look at. Don't worry, I will show it bigger, but I just want to share with you, you can actually find this on my website. I included it in an article that I had written. A couple of evolutionists were arguing that flood geology was nonsense, and I actually included this in part of my rebuttal to that. But you can find it on my website. If you do a search for carbon dating, I'm sure it'll pop up. And I want to go through the three parts of this picture. First off, on top is a scatter plot with these different dates that have been done. Below that is a list of the data points, what the source is measuring, and then a list of the sources. And I'm going to go through these data points with you slowly so that you can get it. That's a list of the different sources. There are 5 main categories. There's humans, mammals, dinosaurs, sea reptiles, which there was only one sea reptile that I could find carbon dating info for, which is why there's only one data point for it. And then examples that were known to be contaminated. That's important. I will talk about that in a moment. Some of the sources for this. The first 2 sources come from the Second International Conference on Creationism that was held in 1990, a peer-reviewed place where creationists can get together and share their original peer-reviewed research, and it's held every couple of years, often abbreviated as ICC. Another place where I got this information was an article or a paper published given at the Twin Cities Creation Science Conference in August 1992, which was put on by the Twin Cities Creation Science Association, I believe it's called. And then they have a website for this research, dinosaur C14ages.com, and I got a lot of these dates from there. And then I also got one of my data points regarding the Clute mammoth from an article that was published in the Mount Blanco Fossil News, March-April 2011 issue. And that date that I got from the Mount Blanco Fossil News magazine was 4,960 years for the Clute mammoth. So, let's look here. We have the first category, humans, specifically Neanderthals. Now, some people have said, oh, you know, Neanderthals aren't human. There's all these differences. From everything that I've seen, I believe that Neanderthals are human, a type of human. Just some of the evidence shows that they were actually living to an older age. So the brow ridge got thicker, and some other things, some other differences appeared in their bones. But it's all related to them living longer than we do today. So yes, I do believe the Neanderthals were fully human. Notice that we have 2 data points, one for about 50,000 and one for about 40,000 years old. Then we have the mammals, including the saber-toothed tiger, which carbon dated at 28,000 years old. You may not be able to see all of the dates there, and I apologize. Then we have mammoths, which carbon dated to right around 4,000 to 5,000 years old. We have woolly, not woolly rhinos. We have a rhinoceros that carbon dated to right around high 20s to, yeah, I think that's 22 to 28,000 years old, something like that. Then we get into dinosaur dates. Notice that these dates, data points 8 through 13, first I want to point out that data points 8 through 12 here are all from the same dinosaur skeleton. All from the same dinosaur skeleton. And notice that they are all very close. So if this is contamination, it's contamination from every point, on every, I'll get into in a moment why it's not contamination, but I did want to point out that all of the different carbon dates that were done did agree. And 3 of these points, the first 3, were measured by the University of Georgia, the UGAMS. 2 of these were measured by Geochron, and then the last point, point number 13 here, was a Triceratops. Those first 5 points were from a hadrosaur, which is kind of like a Parasaurolophus, kind of like this, except the hadrosaur doesn't have, well, a hadrosaur is the name for the general group of dinosaurs that this comes from. So, the reason that I have these separate from the other points that I'll be talking about is because I've actually gotten copies of the laboratory reports for these 6 data points. So I know what those reports said and what they didn't say. And that's why I can stand behind these and say that I've read the reports and I know that there was no hint of contamination or anything. These dates were what was said. These are the dates for the carbon dating. Then when we look at the other set of dinosaur ones for the reports that I have not read, we find a slightly more scattered set of ages, but still rather in alignment. And you'll see here I've named the dinosaur: Allosaurus, Acrocanthosaurus, Hadrosaurs, Triceratops, and Apatosaurus, which is a long-necked dinosaur, and Psittacosaurus, which is a 2-legged beaked dinosaur. Notice that they have scatter of ages anywhere from just under 40,000 to just over 20,000. And this one, notice that this one's kind of an outlier from the rest of the group. Now, I was questioning that one. I thought, that's such an outlier. And I'll actually get into this in a moment, because if you notice, I haven't gotten to the known contamination sets yet. But I said that one was such an outlier, it almost had to be contamination. So I actually called up Hugh Miller and I asked him about this. And he said, yes, that last data point is contamination. So that is part of the contamination group. The sea reptile one, this was actually research that was published not by any creationist as far as I'm aware. As far as I'm aware, this was published by evolutionists. It was carbon dating of a mosasaur, and it carbon dated to just, I believe it was 24,600 years old. So what has happened is the creationists really took the head on this and were talking about this, writing about this, doing the tests and that kind of stuff. And evolution, it got to be such a big thing that the evolutionists were saying, we need to try to disprove this. So they started doing their own carbon dating tests. And now the tests that they're doing, the results that they're getting are seeming to match what had already been done by our group. Or not my group, but creationists like me. And then here we have the 2 known examples of contamination. Both from hadrosaur number 2, which is the same one that those first 5 data points that I showed you from the dinosaurs came from. And notice they ended up much lower than the rest of them. I need to explain. Some people have said, well, we can't trust these carbon dates for any of the dinosaurs. It's all from contamination. What happened, you see, is that some of these early museums would try to use preservatives to save the bones, and they didn't know as much as we do, of course, because we're smarter today. And so they would cover the bones in shellac to try and preserve the bones. And what you're carbon dating isn't the dinosaur bones, it's the shellac on the outside of the bones, which certainly sounds like a very scientific explanation, until you get to finding out that shellac wasn't used that often on the bones to preserve them, if any museum actually used it to preserve them. There's no evidence that any of the museums did use it as a preservative. We do know that we're not entirely sure what all they did use, but we can't know for sure that they used shellac. Second, many of these carbon dating tests were done on little fragments that wouldn't have had any preservative on them. And third, well, third is, I'll get into that in a moment because that's my favorite rebuttal to this. Let's just look quickly at the different sets of data points. We have the humans up here in the 50 to 40,000 year range, which is way too young for Neanderthals because according to evolution, Neanderthals went extinct about 200,000 years ago. We have mammals that carbon date in quite a range. The saber-toothed tiger about 28,000 years old and on down to mammoths about 5,000 years old. Then the dinosaurs anywhere from 20 to 40,000 years old. The mosasaur that carbon dated 24,600 years old. And then the known examples of contamination. So what happened was because of these claims that, oh, it's just contamination, we can't trust them, the creationists said, fine. They took some bones, put shellac on them, tested them. That's what we get. Notice that the contaminated results down here are very, very far off from the main line of the dinosaur results. Very far off. I also want to point out this. The lowest Neanderthal date is 40,700 years old that we looked at in this test. The highest dinosaur date is 39,230 years old. So now, instead of having the dinosaurs living millions of years before humans, we've got human bones carbon dating older than the dinosaurs. So, and notice, like I said, that the contaminated results differ very greatly and are very drastically set off from the mainline dinosaur results. Some people will say, well, like I said, it's just contamination because of the shellac But data points 10 and 13 were collected from inside bones that were never shellacked. So number one, there was no shellac used on the bones at all. Number two, if there had been any preservative at all used on these, it would have been on the outside of the bones. And what happened was for data points 10 and 13, or at least for data point 10, I know, these were collected from inside the bones. The bones themselves were cut open, samples were taken from inside. So there would have been no possible way that any preservative would have been able to seep in that far and get them. In fact, I want to point out data point number 10, which is one of them from the set that I've actually read the reports for. And this is published in Mount Blanco Fossil News. This is actually a picture of the bone being cut open for data point number 10 to be collected. So here we've got a picture, and you'll notice the preservative, the stuff that they have on the outside, is pretty much just plaster of Paris, which would not interfere with carbon dating at all. And like I said, even if it did, that would only affect the outside, not the inside. So there's no possible way that the preservative, whatever it is used on the outside, the plaster cast or whatever, would have seeped in to the inside to interfere with that, which is where the sample was taken for this hadrosaur. I want to point out something to you. This is another graph. This graph lists the creatures that were carbon dated. And it's supposed to show the evolutionary age of when these creatures were supposed to live. Notice that the bottom scale is in millions of years. This is what we should find. We should find at least 5 distinct sets of ages when we break it down. And notice that the Apatosaurus should live here, the Triceratops here. So they should definitely never overlap. In fact, the Apatosaurus and Triceratops should be separated by at least 45.9 million years, at least. But this is what we get when we look at the actual range of carbon dating results. Instead of getting the Neanderthals being younger, we get the Neanderthals being older. we get the mammoths down here, and then everything else that was carbon dated falls into this large middle column from the hadrosaurs and the triceratops, Allosaurus, Acrocanthosaurus, Apatosaurus, Psittacosaurus, Mosasaurus, Smilodon. Notice that the, and this is the year 0, and this is going backwards in time. So notice that the Smilodon, which is the more scientific name for what people commonly think of as the saber-toothed tiger, saber-tooth is actually like a category of tigers. So Smilodon is a specific species of, or a specific genus of saber-toothed tiger. So notice that the saber-toothed tiger actually carbon dated older than the mosasaur, the psittacosaur, and older than some of the carbon dates for the Acrocanthosaurus, Triceratops, and Hadrosaurs. They should be separated by at least 30 to 40 million years at least. But it carbon dates older than some of them. Notice that the Apatosaurus and the Triceratops and the Hadrosaurs, which should never overlap each other, do overlap each other in the carbon dates. So there's a problem here. Either we can trust carbon dating, in which case evolutionists lose their ability to say that dinosaurs lived long times ago, or we can't trust carbon dating, in which case it can't be used as an argument against a young Earth. In fact, my argument would be maybe there's a little bit of both of that going on. I want to highlight some points. The Apatosaur should be at least 45.9 million years older than the Triceratops, but the Triceratops had the oldest carbon-14 date of all the dinosaurs in this data set at 39,230, when in fact it should be one of the youngest, one of the most recent. And compared to the Apatosaurus, which should be older, the Apatosaurus got a carbon date of 38,250, compared to the Triceratops, which should be younger and got an older carbon date by 980 years. The Psittacosaurus should be older than the Mosasaur, the Triceratops, and the Hadrosaurs, but the Psittacosaurus had the youngest carbon-14 date of all the dinosaurs in the data set at 22,020 years. So the ones that should be younger are measuring older, the ones that should be older are measuring younger. At that point, you can't even use it as a relative method of comparison, because it just scrambles the evolutionary timeline. To summarize this data, dinosaur bones have datable amounts of radioactive carbon-14, which evolution says they absolutely should not have, but they do have it. And carbon dating of dinosaur bones yields results less than 40,000 years old, results that are incompatible with evolution. You can check out the website of the Paleo Group at www.dinosaurs-c14ages.com to get more on what they're doing, but I wanted to talk briefly on one other aspect. Some people have said, well, wait a minute, sure, maybe it messes up evolution, but it disproves your theory just as much. Hold on. According to Willard Libby, who came up with carbon dating, it would take about 30,000 years for the carbon-14 in the atmosphere to reach equilibrium. If Earth is younger than that, then it's not at equilibrium, and we will actually be getting more and more carbon-14 as we go on, meaning if we go backwards in the past, there was less in the atmosphere. So some things will artificially date older than they actually are just for that fact. There's another interesting thing called the reservoir effect, which is that creatures that live in the water and get their carbon-14, or their carbon from the sea life, will have a lower amount of radioactive carbon than things that get it from the atmosphere, because radioactive carbon is produced in the atmosphere, then it's absorbed by the plants, then the animals eat the plants, and we eat the plants and the animals, and that's how we get carbon-14 in us. Obviously, then, it would exchange faster with the creatures that are on land than those that are in the sea. So creatures that live in the sea would have lower amounts of the radioactive carbon-14. Some radioactive dating methods, I believe it was potassium argon was one of them, have been shown that if you take an object and put it in water and leave it sit there for a couple of hours, it'll actually date several half-lives, or at least a half-life older than, and I mean the potassium half-life is like millions of years. So just putting it in water for a couple of hours makes it date millions of years older than it actually is. Well, according to the Bible, what did we have? A global flood that would have covered the entire earth for the better part of a year. So we know about the reservoir effect, which causes things that are in the water that exchange carbon with the water to carbon date older than they really are, but sometimes by thousands of years. I mean, there's famous examples out there, snails that were carbon dated at 30,000 years old that were still alive, and penguins that were carbon dated at tens of thousands of years older than they really were, still alive. A freshly killed seal that carbon dated at thousands of years old when it was freshly killed. So I mean, that's just an example. So, but if we know that being submerged in water and exchanging carbon with the water can affect carbon dates in that way, and we have a global flood that submerged the entire Earth, then we have another mechanism to explain, hey, maybe everything that was buried in the flood will carbon date older than it actually is. In addition to that, there's some debate about whether there was any carbon-14 at all before the flood. And there are also discussions about how some of the mechanisms during the flood could have actually produced carbon-14 in the rock layers themselves. I'm not going to get into any of that today. If you'd like to check out more, I know that Walt Brown has written a bit on that, kind of a new idea, so we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. But just from the simple fact that Earth is younger than the equilibrium, so we haven't reached the equilibrium in the atmosphere with carbon-14, which would automatically cause things from the past to carbon date older than they actually are, and from the reservoir effect, which causes things that have been submerged in water to carbon date older than they actually are. Just from those two facts alone, we can show that these carbon dates for dinosaurs, while they are older than what the Bible would allow, are older artificially, meaning that they are actually younger than what the carbon dates are showing. So please do remember, carbon dating is the creationists' friend. They show that dinosaurs lived much more recently than evolution would allow, and we can explain through known causes and known mechanisms why they are older than the Bible allows. I believe that most of the dinosaurs were wiped out in the flood of Noah about 43 to 4,500 years ago. And that's where we get the fossils that some of which I have replicas of or that I've talked about this week. So, like I said, you can check out some of the carbon dating stuff on their website, the Paleo Group's website, dinosaurs.c14ages.com. And that does it for my presentation today. Thank you so much.